Hey, okay. I know it's picking up now. Cool. We'll continue. We'll start this chapter. Skip into this chapter because the rest of the book doesn't seem all that useful. But if this chapter blows my mind, then I may go back and read the rest. It starts with a quote from The Red Flag. It says, "Is eating and drinking a mere trifle? No. And class struggle exists at the tip of your chopsticks." I've heard before. This is a quote that is quoted. I mean, this quote's been in a lot of these books about food in China. Um, so it continues on. The question above and its answer offer a thoroughly Maoist image of the intimacy of class struggle. In 1970, this may have been a fresh phrasing, but ideas linking food and politics were not particularly new in China. For most of the 20th century, modernizing nationalists had been founding their arguments for change on the hunger of the masses and the gluttony of the powerful. Writers of fiction and essays had deployed a complex oral imagery to figure social and political relations of domination and victimization. Farmers and eaters had fought over who would control the land and its produce in China's peasant revolution. And Mao Zedong frequently used metaphors as he expanded the reach of his polemic voice over the whole nation and into every part of the daily life. In keeping with his well-known remark that revolution is not a dinner party, in his report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan, he also famously argued that if you want to know the taste of a pear or have a reliable knowledge, you must bite into it, and described political synthesis as akin to eating crabs, quote unquote, eating one's enemy, involving the absorbing the nourishment and expelling the waste. During the talk at Hangzhou Conference. Throughout the history of the People's Republic, the leadership has offered constant reminders that the political change has direct consequence at the dinner table. At the same time, it has insisted that politics cannot be banished from eating. Socialist egalitarianism should be materially evident in the production, distribution, and consumption of food, and the basic needs of the people should be met in an even-handed manner. When inequalities emerge, rectification might be required. Although the more thoroughly socialist rhetoric requiring state control of production and consumption was discredited and abandoned between the late 1970s and mid 1980s, much of the rationale for market socialism had to do with food as well. Private control of the land and entrepreneurship in distribution would liberate the enthusiasm of the people for labor and thus be more efficient in meeting the nation's needs. The public discourse on food shifted dramatically in the reform period, but it did not disappear. I was reminded of this fact recently when I met an emigre artist. I'm gonna type it in chat. I think that's a better way of doing these when I get to these points. So I don't know what the word is. And I'll take it from chat, and I'll also Google it just in case. All right, so this is finally a word with a definition. Sometimes I'm reading these books and I don't get definitions when I Google them. This one says a person who has left their own country in order to settle in another, typically for political reasons. And the example here quotes a Soviet leaving because of communism in the country. Emigre. Where was I? I was reading. Did I skip a page? No. Okay. I'll reread the sentence. I was reminded of this fact when I met an emigre artist who had left China for New York in the 1990s. He inquired about my research, and I told him the title of this book, quote unquote, Food and Sex in China. He mused, food is so political in China. When I asked him why he thought so, he said that Chairman Mao had always insisted that eating was an important aspect of political struggle, and no one has been able to forget this. Everyone notices what everyone is eating, and no one can avoid being moralistic about food. How food got to be so political in China can be observed in three works of popular literature. Um, one written in the 1940s and revised for the Cultural Revolution, and two published in the 1980s. Not only were these works widely read and admired, each in its own time, but they also addressed certain social problems and historical contradictions that many writers and thinkers agreed were central to the Chinese national situation. These works are quite different, and their conception of the politics and ethics of food reflect distinct political stances, state projects, and aesthetic strategies. One is an opera ballad, and the other two are novella. Each adopts an accessible and evocative writing style to clarify for its readers the way in which class struggle can exist at the tip of your chopsticks. The first literary work considered here, the white-haired girl m- became a model theatrical work. The preferred and it the preferred and its time and at its time sorry and at times almost the only genre of art made available by Cultural Revolution leaders, and thus it is generally thought of as a straightforward party propaganda. The second text discusses Hibiscus Town. It is often seen as part of popular resistance to government programs, although, as we shall see, its depiction of early reform era market changes is consistent with Deng Xiaoping with the Deng Xiaoping economics of the time. These first two pieces of literature define the basic human need and outline the distribution of social responsibility that should meet those needs. They do not leave these fundamental definitions to chance. Both answer recurrent 20th century Chinese questions: what forms and levels of sustenance do the people need, and who shall remain in power by seeing that they get it? And both locate eating in broader narratives that have very clear political agendas. They sort and resort the confusing plenum of social work into categories that distinguish producers from consumers, needs from wishes, exploiters from victims, goods, good humans from evil monsters, and the hopeful present from the abysmal past. In doing so, each naturalizes a tidied up social world. The third work to be taken up in this chapter, The Gourmet, although it appeared only a few years after Hibiscus Town, shares some of the white-haired girl's leftist commitments. Pointedly destabilizes the politics of food. Excuse me. There we go. The politics of food embodied in these two works. In this history of antagonism between a conscientious communist restaurant manager and a self-indulgent, quote unquote, specialist in beautiful food, no equilibrium between culinary pleasure and political justice can be found. One can only enjoy good food, it seems, at the expense of someone else's labor. The contradictory politics of eating that is meticulously outlined in this work informs my reading of all three texts. Food itself realizes the intractable inequalities with which we must somehow live. I'm just going to highlight for a second. No one's watching, so I'm not boring anybody. Not anybody yet. Somebody may watch here. Hi, Katie. I'm streaming.
I'm aware.
You good? Okay.
Do you know where the fire stick remote is?
No, it's probably on the table.
Which table?
The black one.
What are you talking about? The side tables?
No, the bookshelf.
Oh.
Okay. With that, I will continue on. One second. Okay. As I suggested in Chapter 1, in the contemporary People's Republic, both Chinese food and Chinese medicine offer their delicacies as commodities, and some of them are expensive. The enjoyments they offer can command even higher prices from an emerging entrepreneurial class, but few contemporary consumers of elegant cuisine and expensive medicines have been able to indulge their newly refined palates throughout their lives. Many who now pick and choose among national and transnational commodities understand their recent pleasures in contrast to their memories of a simpler, poorer, or hungrier past. In many parts of China these days, and in the national media as well, acute hunger is usually depicted as a thing of the past. With a few exceptions, the truly hungry have seldom written of their experiences. while they were living while they were living them or in the present tense. Hunger remembered and inscribed into a historical narrative has, however, taken on the great importance in genres ranging from historiography of Maoism to the consumer-oriented mass media of the 1990s. In this connection, there are at least three modern historical episodes to which Chinese chroniclers readily refer. The first is the era of poverty and food shortage associated with the widespread social chaos of the war years between 1930s and 1949. This is the period often referred to as, quote unquote, the Old Society. The second is the famine that followed. The development of the Great Leap Forward, which began in 1958. These three hard years, quote unquote, as they are widely known, led to. Okay, I didn't. I don't think they. I remember that they were called that in the other book I read. Um, these three hard years, as they were widely known, led to an estimated 30 million deaths from starvation, perhaps 5% of the population. Between 1959 and 1962, shortages reached even into the elite compound of the capital city. Capital city's highest cadres. The third period is in which a significant part of the population regularly experienced hunger was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution of 1966 through 1976. Those who remember the food shortages of this period are a minority, but they are influential. They are mostly, quote unquote, educated youth who were sent down to parts of the countryside where food supplies were scanter than in the cities, and a smaller number of intellectuals and cadres who were sent down to labor reform camps where they were sometimes proudly starved, sometimes pointedly starved. It is members of this sent down group, some of whom turned to writing after returning home or being rehabilitated, who have most clearly thematized cultural revolution hunger into contemporary literature and journalism. Their narratives of hunger both place shortages firmly in the past, although there are plenty of people in China today without enough to eat, and privilege the the phases that have their narratives are plenty. Sorry, their narratives of hunger both place shortages firmly in the past and privilege the phases that have been especially important to intellectuals in a public discourse that is easily dominated by the educated and the powerful. Thus, writing about the suffering of a limited number of intellectuals between 1966 and 1976 has always been much greater in volume than literary reflections on the disastrous famine of the late 1950s. It is worth noting, however, that the earlier Maoist genre of quote unquote speaking bitterness, in which peasants and workers addressed public meetings with harrowing accounts of their suffering before the liberation of the late 1940s. of the late 1940s may have established many conventions that have informed all genres of writing about hunger and oppression. Not everyone in China can remember um, Not everyone in China can remember personal starvation, however, and not all memories accord with the official periodization of hunger in China. Many born after the nationwide famine of 1959 through 1961 have never had to skip a meal, and others date their current good fortune from a much later time than the economic recovery of the early 1960s. Residents of the village in central Shandong, where I have spent time, for example, say that they were desperately poor until well after the famine was over. Finally, a government expert helped them successfully reorganize their farming practices in the 1970s. There are regional differences as well. Many farmers in the well-watered South did better at private small farmers before liberation than under collectivization, and are now reported to recall the years before the 1949 as fatter than any since. This difference in productivity and rural standard of living between southern and northern areas explains some of the differences between the two of the works I discuss in this chapter. The white-haired girl describes polemically the near starvation of northern villages in winter. Hibiscus Town depicts the population in the years before the national famine as fairly well fed. In the coastal plains further north, where the land is flat and the weather dry but fairly predictable, there are still benefits to collective agriculture, and some villages have clung stubbornly to the organizational forms they learned from socialism. At the same time, rural planners have noted the reemergence of poor villages and families in areas where local leaders have abdicated all collective responsibilities. These struggling farmers thus include some who see the years of socialist agriculture as fat, and the current regime of sink or swim entrepreneurism as very lean indeed. Despite those local and individual differences, the broad history of hunger in China is widely agreed upon. It is still a civic duty to remember the bitterness of the old society before the 1949 establishment of the People's Republic. School textbooks, state-sponsored films, and television documentaries reinforce the standard trajectory from the bitterness of the old society to the more hopeful and well-fed times of party-led socialism. More recent works have moved on to glorify the new wealth and cosmopolitan consumption of the reform period, but many still sort out the good guys from the bad guys along class lines. The suffering of today's poor migrant workers, farmers trapped on poor land in the interior, members of minority communities in underdeveloped parts of the country, are no longer part of a progressive historical narrative. Rather, they are depicted as pitiable and unfortunate casualties of the capitalist economic order. That is essentially good, natural, and permanent. Insofar as hunger is systematic, policymakers agree that adjustments must be made to equalize the rate and rewards of development throughout the country and the population. But unlike previous historical periods in which the people ate a lot of bitterness, but their suffering could character a revolution. Oh, charter a revolution, not character. Their suffering could charter a revolution. Hunger is now a problem not for political morality, but for developmental science. Excuse me. A distinction between a national essential state economic history of China and the particular narratives of ordinary people became important in the 1980s, especially in the hands of memoir writers and muckraking journalists who collect the personal stories of ordinary people. Although the voices of common people collected by journalists resemble the speaking bitterness narratives, normally they were not a state-sponsored genre. These new kinds of narratives were thought of as a second liberation, giving scope to the voices of ordinary people who had suffered from errors of an overzealous party and its representatives. Thus, it was tempting to see these stories of eating bitterness as part of the depoliticizing cultural tendencies of the Reform era. Many of the stories in this genre oppose the political and the personal, seeing bitter experiences as a personal dimension in an over-politicized world. Along with everyone else, as the stories tend to go, the protagonist was oppressed by the Maoist politics that penetrated into every corner of daily life. He or she was afraid not to think and act politically. When the Gang of Four fell, it was possible to quote unquote return to a natural order in which everyone could look after his or her own affairs and seek happiness without the influence of the new reform pragmatic state. As we shall see, Hibiscus Town fits this mold in many ways, but I should point out in advance that I cannot consider this narrative convention with I cannot consider this narrative convention with its important shift toward the personal to be a form of depoliticization. Uh, Rather, it represents a reconfiguration of the political field, reinventing the domestic and the personal as new domains of politics, separate from power struggles at the level of state leaders. The intensity with which Chinese people of the 1980s turned towards seeking their own happiness strongly suggests a kind of political movement. This insistence on private lives bespeaks a resistance self-positioning in a power-infused public field. This section is called Remembering Bitterness, the White-Haired Girl. Let me take some highlights while we sit quietly. Okay. Sorry for the bit of silence there. I don't know how to make it sound interesting as I'm going back and trying to remember what's worth highlighting. But nonetheless, continue on. It says, The initial version of classic 1940s opera, The White-Haired Girl, was written in the liberated areas, quote unquote, as a way of educating rural people about the land reforms uh, of the about the land reform goals of the Chinese Communist Party. The play combined most of the elements of the old society that would define historical bitterness for subsequent generations. Crushing debt, oppression of women, and substitution, sorry, not substitution, says uh, crushing debt, oppression of women, superstitious delusion, and hunger. The story is simple. A tenant farmer is forced to sell his daughter, Shi to the landlord to settle a $25 debt and kills himself in shame. Later versions have old Yang dying from a beating administered by the landlord's thugs after he had refused to turn over his daughter. Shi raped and pregnant, is eventually hounded out of the landlord's household and takes refuge in the caves outside the village. There, she and her infant daughter subsist on scanty raw food, offerings stolen from the local temple. Nutritional deficiency turns her hair white and glimpsed occasionally late at night. She comes to be feared as a powerful ghost. Eventually, the Eighth Route Army, which is liberating the area, finds her and turns her back into a human being. By exposing her story and prosecuting the landlord and his clique, the people are dissuaded from their superstitions and throw themselves wholeheartedly into land reform. It's a very simple play, but it's funny. Well, I mean, this is clearly a summary, but it's still kind of like a simple plot. The opera was performed throughout the country from the late 1940s onward. It was later rewritten as a ballad in the Cultural Revolution period and joined a few model theatricals as one of the few sources of cultural representation. Between the 1960s and the beginning of the reform period in the late 1970s, theater of this kind was a genre useful to the ambitious propaganda goals of the Maoist regime. There were public stages and traveling performers active in many parts of China in the 1940s and 50s, and it was relatively cheap for local governments to provide new material for actors and singers to find places for them to perform even in the smallest villages. Something had to be done with these people as all forms of livelihood had come under the sway of government management. Thus, for a time before television became common in rural areas, and this was not until the late 1980s, even in relatively developed areas, the itinerant theatrical the itinerant theatrical was an important medium for the voice of the state. Those who didn't see the plays on stage saw them in film. Versions, mounted by government projections, teams, or broadcast on televisions that were collectively owned, one per village, as a result of the state monopoly over the arts, which is only now really breaking up. Works like The White-Haired Girl were extremely influential. People above a certain age tend to know at least a few model operas by heart. This has been remarked in some of the English language autobiographies of the Chinese emigres, but it became especially evident to me when watching The Red Lantern on television in a Beijing dormitory common room in the 1997. The building's custodial staff gathered around to sing along with their favorite arias. They were obviously enjoying themselves. The White-Haired Girl demonstrates how natural it was in the Chinese socialist context to think social inequality in terms of eating and drinking. At the beginning, when the rich are celebrating the new year in grand style and the poor join forces to scrape together a few steamed dumplings, this difference in complacently noted by landlord Huang and his family. Glories in the sky, libations on earth, bespeak a rich harvest. Lanterns are sorry, itch on my hand. Okay, we'll proceed. Glories in the sky, libations on earth, bespeak a rich harvest. Lanterns are hung and banners unfurled, celebrating this night of plenty. All in the household laughingly make joyous offerings. It's not so much wine as complacency that intoxicates us. I guess that's the song. So let's do, like right there. In the next scene, as snow blows around the stage, a poor peasant sings a parallel aria. High winds and heavy snow fill the air. Lamplight shines from only a few houses. We too celebrate the new year with everyone else. But a poor people's new year is not like the holiday of the rich. In the lordly houses there is wine and meat. In the homes of tenant farmers there is neither rice nor flour. In fact, flour has been painfully acquired, a pound at a time, by several local families. One lucky youth even gets a hold of a pound of pork. Thus it is that these humble peasants, demonstrating their spontaneous collectivism, can gather together for a New Year's Eve meal of dumplings, constantly demonstrating their affection for and trust of each other, and forgetting for a while the depredation of the landlord's debt collecting steward. They are even able to dream of the day when Shi Er and her young neighbor might marry. This scene of eating makes a strong contrast with the only eating actually witnessed in the landlord's house. Poor Shi Er, sold to the wealthy Huang family and working as a serving maid, is constantly scolded and beaten for bungling the preparation of sweet lotus seed soup for her mistress. Madame Huang, reclining alone with her bed curtains, with her opium pipe, cannot be satisfied. The soup is too hot, too cold, or too bitter because the lotus has not been properly cleaned. Shi Er is of course is a nervous wreck, trying to anticipate the whims of the picky eaters. Another servant comforts her. It tastes bitter because smoking too much opium makes a bitter taste in her mouth. Madame Huang, uh, alimentary, alimentary. I'm gonna type this word down so that way if somebody feels to correct me, they can. Alimentary. And then I'll also Google it. Relating to nourishment or sustenance. Okay. I totally lost where I was. Here it is. Madame Huang's alimentary habits are thus at the other end of the scale, from those of her sons, tenant farmers, eating an exotic and not very filling food alone. She cannot enjoy it because of her overindulgence in an even more expensive luxury, opium. Unlike the poor who eat bitterness, Madame Huang only imagines that her lot is in life as hard. Not only has the landlord class gained control of all the land, it has lost touch with the simple human enjoyment that eating brings in train. The ritual, filial, and reproductive riches enjoyed by Jie and her neighbors, despite their extreme poverty, render them naturally human, while their oppressors have clearly become monsters who cannot distinguish the bitterness from the sweet. A clear distinction between necessity and luxuries underlies the political trajectory of the play. As the abuse of the tenant farming system progressively remove all the ingredients of a decent livelihood from the homes of the peasants, it becomes more and more difficult for the people to sustain human life. The play opens with Jie Er worried about their father. Old Yang, who has fled the village to avoid the end-of-year collection of his debt to the Huangs, will not return from his hiding place in time for the holiday. The ritual calendar, according to which social ties are reaffirmed thoroughly through commensality is in danger of being violated. Poverty puts humanity itself at risk. Although Xie and her family are able to pass New Year's Eve eating dumplings with neighbors, when old Yang dies by his own hands that night, mortified by the ravages inflicted by his debt, it becomes clear that not even physical life can be sustained under these conditions. Grain and meat, simple sustaining foods, are necessities. Lotus seed soup and opium are the unnecessary food of monsters. Of course, the landlord class gets what is coming to it by the end of the opera. Liberation has reversed the situation that was so advantageous to to landlord Huang and his family. As representatives of the new Eighth Route Army, government convene a mass meeting to criticize the landlords. We possess the grain collected in their granaries and reduce the rent. A jubilant chorus of peasants sing as follows. The crimes of 1,000 years must be punished. The injustice of 10,000 years must be rectified. Once forced to become a ghost, Xie can now become a human again. Crushing rents must be reduced. The grain we have paid must be reclaimed. Those who have known bitterness all their lives will stand up and rule with dignity. Today, that's the song, or I guess they're singing it, so it's a song. But continue on here. It says. Like other works of official literature produced in the service of the Chinese Revolution, The White-Haired Girl emphasizes class struggle and revenge. The wisdom of the people, we are told, is to materially support each other while never forgetting who their enemies are. The model theatrical works of the Cultural Revolution period provided many examples, but the much earlier White-Haired Girl already shows the relationship between comradeship, figured in food exchange, and antagonism toward those who made life so bitter. When the landlord's house servant, Auntie Chang, helps Xie to escape, for example, she advised the girl, "Here are some rolls. Mind you, only drink running water while you're on the run. Never forget how they harmed your family, child. Never forget. The right that The right that finally triumphs in the end is a marked reversal of the poles. The power to dominate is apparently transferred to a different social bloc. The closing word the closing words of the opera find sweetness not in the promise of food and less drudgery for all, but in the reversed political hierarchy and the promise that the guilty will be severely punished. And then there's another portion of the play here I'll read. It says, Landlord Huang, you have bowed your head. You quake with dread. Age-old feudal bonds today are cut away. Crushing iron chains will be smashed to bits today. We who suffered in days bygone shall be our masters from this day on. In this political logic, living well is not revenge enough. Apparently, past bitterness was to be remembered, and present sweetness reflected on. Not simply to produce sentiments of gratitude and satisfaction among the people, those guilty of greedy exploitations must be punished until the end of the Maoist cultural regime. This structure of memory served to advance the continuing revolution and keep nature and necessity of class struggle clear. Enemies in the bad classes were monsters, while the common people displayed a spontaneous solidarity and eminent humanity. At the same time, works like The White-Haired Girl asserted the primacy of socialist rationality over the unruly senses and desires by using narrative to translate the people's material needs into a state-sanctioned structure of rule. The party's intervention would be needed if all the hungry would be fed in this politics. In this politics, every pang of hunger, every bite of food, every caddy stored grain had a class character and an almost martial significance. Distinct forms of eating separated the Chinese people from their old society exploiters. In popular consciousness, dumplings can be a figure for the sustenance to which the people had natural right, wrapping into one round parcel the grain, vegetables, and meat that were in hard times so difficult for poor people to gather together. In Maoist China, dumplings often functioned as a code for a human minimum guaranteed by the revolution. In the old society, we didn't see meat for year to year, but now we can have dumplings whenever we want. This is the sort of thing people would say in summing up the achievements of the People's Republic. Meanwhile, for several decades, elite luxury foods like lotus seed soup disappeared from public view completely. What an interesting section. Now I'm going to go back, as I've done before, and highlight again. Yeah. Just rolling in my chair, sorry. Man. Okay, I'll read the next section. I'm not sure if I'll keep reading after this section, but this next section is about the Hibiscus Town novella. Speaking bitterness along with remembering bitterness while reflecting on present sweetness was a technique through which Maoist regime tried to keep the naturalized duality of liberation and the land reform era alive among the people. Bitterness needed to be blamed on evil exploiters and the sweetness credited to the goodness of the party state. But memory is tricky. It can be paradoxically evoke. It can paradoxically evoke experiences that work against official historical narratives. Times of shortage have often led people to remember in the wrong direction, savoring past sweetness and reflecting critically on the present bitterness. Hibiscus Town plays with this slippery temporality. When terms drawn from everyday life of the body are used to figure vast collective histories, everyday experiences can be appropriated in unexpected ways. In hard times, the authority of one person's history may be invoked to insist that present bitterness cannot compare to past, even to pre-liberation sweetness, although the whole history of China after liberation had been officially sweet compared to the bitterness of the old society. By the early 1980s, it had no longer a political requirement that ordinary people could sustain the simplified account of what was supposed to be their own experience. Not only had the compulsory mass campaigns receded in importance, the beginning of the reform period saw numerous literary journalistic attempts to remember the flavors of good times and bad, and to recast them as individual rather than national experiences. Bodily imagery in these writings is sometimes a metaphor for broad social change, and sometimes an indictment Maybe I'm just stupid. Is indictment supposed to like INDICT? Is that indictment? Yes, it's indictment. I've always not known what to do with that word. When I hear it, I know what it means, but I don't know. It's just that I haven't read it very much. Okay. Totally lost where I was. Here it is. As an indictment of the excess of Maoist politics, which distorted the down-to-earth wisdom of the people. The most powerful writing of the early years of the Reform period were excruciatingly concrete in their descriptions of violations of bodily health and dignity, showing how class struggle became very literal and material for some during the Cultural Revolution. But by rewriting history as a chronicle of personal bodily events, this literature also produced a new and seductive idiom for the memories of those who read it. In many different ways, the new fiction and reportage used the language of embodiment to privatize what had been a thoroughly public everyday life. In the same gesture, the realistic genres of the early 1980s appeared to depoliticize the private life of Chinese citizens. Gu Hua's 1981 novel Hibiscus Town is a fairly typical example of the genres of popular literature that appeared after 1979. Widely read at a time when novels were immensely influential, it was quickly made into a film that remained in distribution for a long time, telling an typical early reform story. The book was an important influence on the new structure of memory that emerged after the fall of the Gang of Four, to recast the politics of everyday life, less starkly moralistic than its model opera predecessors, but still clear about the distinction between good and evil characters. It develops a cast of sympathetically drawn workers and peasants whose lives are nearly destroyed through the machinations of a small group of corrupt ideologies. Ideologues. In a southern river town, the fortunes of a rice and bean curd vendor, Hu Yu Yin, and her customers rise and fall in response to various national, regional governmental campaigns. Hu Yu Yin early falls afoul of an ambitious party cadre who manages the state-run restaurant in town, resenting the competition of both the bean curd stand and its attractive proprietress. This frustrated spinster turns every political campaign against Yu Yin and her honest, hardworking friends. Yu Yin suffers the death of her first husband early on, and then imprisonment of her lover, as well as the regular humiliation of being struggled against as a new rich peasant, one of the 5 bad categories. The town becomes an oppressive place, rife with suspicion, everyday talk, silenced in fear of political reprisal for any ill-judged remark. Eventually, of course, after the arrest of the Gang of Four, the abuses of the evil cadre Li Guoxiang and her opportunistic allies are rectified, and the people of the Hibiscus Town re-emerge as honest, trusting souls who helped each other and willingly share the necessities of life. The town's most vocal ideologue is hustled off to an asylum, clearly insane because he won't stop shouting, "Never forget class struggle!" And I'll just keep repeating that. Some of the conventional oversimplifications of this novel are obvious even from this brief summary. The sexually frustrated single woman who sets all manner of social destruction in motion, the rapid political reversal through which rhetoric that yesterday persuaded or at least struck fear into the hearts of ordinary people, today comes to sound like more madness. The simple goodness of the townsfolk, which require only the removal of the oppressive hand of government to flower again. These are narrative elements that need not surprise us. Perhaps more interesting, however, is a parallel narrative of the level of descriptions of everyday life, the naturalistic ground from which the more dramatic events of the story spring. At the outset of the novel, for instance, Hibiscus Town is depicted as a convivial place where a full ritual calendar is marked by all manner of special meals and food exchanges. It also has a lively periodic market where people and products of many kinds mix freely, and everyone, even the dung dealers who collect his good after the market closes, depends on the profit from this relatively unregulated commerce. The heightened state actively brought to the countryside by the Great Leap Forward severely restricts this market activity, however, and those who sell the products of their own labor on private plots or in the mountains have to do so warily, looking out for confiscations or extra taxes. Partly as a result, the people go hungry. The happy conclusion of the novel, as we shall see, returns free market to the town, with every even more variety and liveliness than before. This trajectory from free market to free market via state repression and hunger is consistent with the economic policies of the early reform period. State controls over production and distribution were removed first in the countryside, and household responsibility system in the household responsibility system that returned land to the farmers on long-term contracts also encouraged them to make a profit on their produce in whatever ways they could. While the government continued to buy in its quota of mandated grain, prices were significantly increased, and many entrepreneurial opportunities were suddenly opened to rural producers. Hibiscus Town, submitted to the censors in 1981, was rapidly approved for publication, no doubt in part because of its final lyrical invocation of the rich and earthy culture of rural markets and its acknowledgement that to get rich is glorious, like the slogan being propagated through official channels in 1981. The novel presented direct market exchange between producers as natural and state co-optation of the market function as a historical deviation. A fictional work thus contributes to the Reform era's economic revisionism by presenting a morality tale that could vividly demonstrate the cost of national policy errors in the lives of the common people. Hibiscus Town addressed the lives of its readers and its use of food and drink to figure the social problems of various years, decades, and campaigns in the People's Republic. Hu Yu Yin serves her bean curd soup on market day with a smile and a joke, while the employees of the state restaurant are surly and uncooperative. An honest northerner endears himself to the townspeople by learning to eat their many kinds of hot peppers and their local favorites of snake, cat, and dog meat. When yet another directive for the inspection and regulation of peddlers come down from higher administrative levels. People complain about the cadres in cities and towns who receive grain coupons, a system that institutionalized a classic distinction between producers and consumers. Those people on state salaries eating state grain while still think they should control whether people have oil, salt, firewood, and rice, whether the people's bellies are empty or full. Moreover, the functionaries who patrol the few remaining markets often confiscated choice goods for politically motivated bribes to more powerful cadres. Thus, food figures corruption as well as honesty. In secret, it also cements social ties and surreptitious wedding feasts between two illicit lovers is blessed by the visit of a friendly older cadre. A drinking bout between discredited old friends leads to an episode of noisy truth telling in the middle of the night, and a shared roast chicken launches the rather disgusting love affair of two cynical cadres. In all of these vignettes, food signifies something beyond nourishment and pleasure. And the history of the nation is told as one small town's eating is chronicled. Gu Hua thus uses novelistic methods to rewrite history in broad strokes. This new version of the meaning of People's Republic was straightforwardly populist and deliberately opposed to class struggle. It is worth noting, for example, that one important difference between the structures of the white-haired girl and the hibiscus town is that the latter eschews class revenge. The female cadre who puts so much viciousness into motion in the end of him is merely banished into marriage with a party official in a faraway city, while her slogan earring henchman is sent off to a hospital. It is enough apparently simply to remove the worst abusers of the people's trust from the everyday life of the town. By the time the novel appeared, most of those demonized by one faction or another during the Cultural Revolution had rehabilitated in their property and usually positions restored. The ranks of the forgiven included peoples of all political persuasions who might themselves have had some difficulty forgiving those who had betrayed them. The situation was a source of some anxiety for years, and the reform period began. After the reform period began, the first step toward historical rectification was to scapegoat a few leaders, the Gang of Four, and depict them as master manipulators of public opinion. But in the long run, only the complete abandonment of the Maoist idea of class struggle and the state's eventual cancellation of all class labels in the late 1980s could slowly assuage the guilt and rage of the people. This fundamental shift in state policy promised much for the future. Here again, just like before, we have some quotes from the book. Take a second to breathe. At the same time, it had important implications for how the past was to be remembered. What had once been a revolutionary liberation could now be recalled as pathology. All right. Okay. I'll continue on. The practice of remembering itself is sensitively explored in Hibiscus Town. In a passage called "A Feast for the Mind," here the author both deplores and laughs about hunger in a way that productively muddles the standard categories, as follows. Remember the expression "a feast for the mind." It was a local joke, a product of eating in the communal canteens in 1960 and 1961. For months, the cadres in the Wu Ling Mountains had seen no oil or meat. In fact, for more than a year, their teeth had rarely bitten anything solid. Their vegetable diet had nothing but fiber. There was almost no fat or protein. The more you ate squash leaves, the skinnier you'd get. Bellies stuck to backbone. The gullet stuck out their hands to beg. Of course, this was blamed on the imperialists, revisionists, and counter-revolutionaries, as well as Old Man Heaven. Old Man Heaven had become one of the 5 bad categories, maliciously stirring up trouble for the people and the communal canteens. Later, the famine was blamed on the Peng Dehuai Li Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping line because those leaders opposed the red flag. All eat from one big pot program. Looking back 20 years, Gu Hua here reminds his readers of some of the slogans that had ruled their lives during the famine years. He allows the passage of time to lump all of these political values into one slightly ludicrous category, despite the fact that two quite separate phrases of policy are referenced. Clearly, these ideas must have been mistaken at the time of writing. Deng Xiaoping um, Deng Xiaoping was already hard at work engineering China's economic reform policies. Moreover, it is a joke on the arrogant ambition of the revolution, now visible after the fact, that old man heaven is classified with the 5 bad categories of class enemies. As the passage continues, the satirical tone continues to maintain a historical prescriptive on the ways in which, during the Commune years, dietary shortages were mixed up with political contradictions. Which was wrong with those What was wrong with those meals from one big pot anyway? Well, it was a steady diet of greens and turnips without oil, served up with a dose of remembering and comparing, recalling past bitterness and reflecting on present sweetness. Excuse me. If you think this is hard, just remember how hard it was for the Red Army on the longer march. Thus, eating and remembering go hand in hand. In a commune that hopes the people will swallow both in famine rations and its preferred account of history. In theory, linking the provision of food to a narrative of the past should be a very effective method of nation building. But if the food is terrible, the more one eats, the skinnier one gets. Eventually, the contradictions of the situation will emerge. The connection no longer makes carnal sense. As follows. Here's another passage from the book. I wonder how those first heroes who sacrificed their lives in snowy mountains, grassy steppes for the liberation and well-being of the Chinese people would have seen it. Damn it! Do you think they ate the bark from the trees and the roots of the grass so people could sit like idiots in communal canteens, eating rag out of squash leaf? The commune members in the hills couldn't understand the abstrusive metaphysics expounded in lofty pavilions and vast palaces. For ordinary people, food is all, and the comrade only knew that their stomachs ached from hunger and their mouths were watering for food. After eating fern or sweet cakes, your stool would be as hard as an iron. Jam up the rectum and make it bleed. You'd have to poke with a little stick or dig it with a finger. Life really sucked. Okay. Hard times indeed. Even the ordinary enjoyment of a bowel movement was apparently out of reach. Here, Gu Hua satirizes the idiocy of calling famine foods by elevated names. Rag out of squash leaf, and sees the practice of remembering and comparing as incomprehensible metaphysics, emanating from the lofty pavilions, the vast palaces, that is, government above. Still, the presumption remains that the revolution was, or should have been, about simple bodily well-being, something the people apparently know all about. The residents of Hibiscus Town, hungry as they are, presume that the achievement of a normal digestive life for all is the obvious cause for which their revolutionary heroes sacrifice so much. Even within the satirical critique, some close relationship between political language and everyday eating is still imagined. The feast for mind goes on to weave speech and food, thought and senses still more closely together. The daytime was not too bad, but at night people couldn't sleep, so they devised a way to make up their short rations. They would trade recollections telling where and when, with whom and on what occasion they had the richest feasts, whole chickens and fish, fat meatballs and crispy skinned legs of pork, chunks of fatty meat almost too big to get their chopsticks around. Of course, What these mountain people most loved to eat on the snowy day was dog. If one family made a meal of dog, the aroma would entice all the neighbors. Dog meat is deliciously greasy. Every belch brings up some of that good oily flavor, and very filling it warms the whole body. Dog is usually thought of as a tasty but crude, hardly hardly the sort of thing for fancy banquets. But it moistens yin and strengthens yang, especially for working men on the streets. It makes a great snack and keeps them going for long hours. Thus, for both storytellers and their listeners, it was as if their eyes were beholding a delectable vision, and their noses could smell the aroma of meat. It had everyone drooling. Well, life is long, and they get their chance later. They fixed their hopes for a full stomach on the days to come. That's the end of that section. That's the end of the portion of the text, but the section continues on as follows. This hope for full stomachs in the future is, of course, the standard deferral typical of progressive state ideologies and especially Chinese communist rhetoric. Communist rhetoric. As propaganda frequently promised in the early years of the People's Republic, the achievement of true communism would be accomplished by food for all. The imaginary banquet recounted in Hibiscus during the darkest nights of the famine are an even more satisfying vision than that of the state, however. Meat that warms the whole body and keeps one going for long hours will eventually be available again in the days to come. The party may confine its ambitions to feeding all at a minimal level, meeting their needs for survival alone. Ordinary people, however, when they dream of an end of hunger, have higher hopes. They remember and desire not only satiation, but pleasure, not only a meal, but long days of strength, health, and enjoyment. Promises about the future naturally recall the national political situation, and as the passage continues, a certain down-home patriotism and faith in the state emerges. And here's another section from the book. Now that more than 10 years had passed since liberation, a few people in this mountain town had had some schooling and knew a thing or two about language. So they fixed on this genteel expression, "A feast for the mind is it wasn't on this genteel expression, a feast for the mind." It wasn't popular for very long, maybe 6 months to a year in a few villages and towns. In our 5,000 years of history, and 10 million square kilometers of territory, haven't many famines occurred? There have been times when destitute people and starved corpses were all over the place. So, looked at in the vast stream of Chinese history, what did this little feast of the mind really amount to? You have to distinguish the old empire from the new People's Republic. They're as different as night and day. After all, the new China had only been in existence for 11 or 12 years. We had to start from scratch and feel our way along. If we wanted to learn how to be a modern society, the nation and the Chinese people would have to pay some tuition fees. In the end, it would be up to the posterity to judge our achievements and our mistakes. In these last few lines, the author adopts the official phrases in a slightly more sympathetic tone. The image of the people shifts a bit. No longer are they hapless victims dominated by irrational politics from above. Instead, they are wise survivors who know how to use an imaginative deferral to get through times of hardship. Whether present hunger is displaced via memory into a better fed past or contemporary political disasters, it seems is seen as a tuition fee paid for lessons about the future of achievement of a modern society. The point is that present suffering is not as important as it seems. Moreover, people remember both politics and food, and the hope for both material well-being and a sound national society. Insofar as the dominant recollection reframes that frames the text is one of a famine that took place after the establishment of socialism. Gu Hua reperiodizes modern Chinese history, placing the most important bitterness in New China rather than Old Society. This is a strong critique, typical of the scare genre with which hibiscus tea can be classified. The scar genre with which hibiscus tea can be classified. It is entirely in keeping with the political tenor of much of the early 1980s writing, moreover, embodying a critique centered on extremist abuses without directly challenging the Communist Party regime or socialist principles. The imagined the image that may come closest to a fundamental critique is the stew of greens and turnips without oil, a nasty food in a paragraph fragrant with cultural culinary delights, ladled out in the commune canteens. This is the form in which the official history. Man, this page is not turning. This is the form in which the official historiography of recalling bitterness is fed to the people's readers in the Reformed 1980s are expected to respond never again, rejecting a watered down ideology at the same time as they refuse a flavorless food. The passage quoted above appear near the beginning of Hibiscus Tea. By the end of the book, which chronicles the cruelties visited upon townsfolk in the name of ideological mass campaigns during the Cultural Revolution. The reform period is beginning and state propaganda has receded as far as free market reopened. There has moreover been a significant change in the significance of food. The connections between ideological and material food, past and future, that characterized the feast for the mind are obliterated in this orgy of rural consumerism. The passage begins by reminding readers of Maoist market regulations as follows. This spring saw a great change in the hibiscus market. In the past, when people were from the hills had gone there to peddle furs, herbs, and other mountain products, it was like a black market. They had to have eyes in their back of their heads and be aware of which way the wind was blowing. It was forbidden to sell grain, tea, oil, peanuts, soybeans, cotton, lumber, pigs, cow, and goats, because they were among the three types of commodities on which the state had a monopoly. As for pork and beef, even those who raised animals rarely tasted meat, from one end of the year to the other, being forced to sell even their suckling pigs to the state. Only if a pig died from disease could they take it to market and sell it as adversity pork. As for the townsfolk, their meat ration was half a pound per head per month, sometimes only obtainable illegally through a back door. Adversity pork is one of those small historical jokes typical of the Reform period. When state redistribution was strong, it was not a joke at all, but a strong technical term like quote unquote USDA prime. Maoist language was full of such terms, marketing the socialist state's intention to unify thought, economy, and sustenance in its role as mother and father of the people. After free market reemerged, any such euphemism united a revolutionary romantic word like adversity with a down-to-earth word like pork or meat could raise a smile. One might wonder, adversity for whom? The state? The producers? Perhaps it was really only adversity for the pig. Encapsulated in adversity pork was a whole revolution in language and everyday life. Once the revolution was over and politics and eating had been sundered, so convenient for a market economy not to be hindered by a political moralism. Such terms became an ironic little snack for the mind. The list of state-controlled agricultural products in this passage, grain, tea, oil, peanut, soybean, cotton, lumber, pig, cow, and goat, offered a conventional catalog of everyday needs, along with fuel and green vegetables, and the 3 chickens each household was allowed to raise. These are things people needed to get by. They are also things they would not be allowed to supply directly to each other. There are no luxuries and little variety on this list. One sacrifice that had been made for the revolution was the little difference in daily cuisine that had once marked Hibiscus Town's social life. But all this is about to change. And then it continues on as follows. What amazing tricks time can play. A little over 2 years after the fall of the Gang of Four, it was like a different world for the towns. People they had entered a fresh new era. Now, Hibiscus had a market fair 6 times a month. So, to it flocked Yao and Shuang and Zhuang girls in their colorful clothing and sparkling silver trinkets. Han youngsters all spruced up, bike riders with a laughing girl perched on the back, householders and their wives, beaming with satisfaction, bulging purses and their waists. People came in couples or small groups, carrying loads of tender shallots or crisp fresh cabbages. Lugging crates or baskets full of speckled hen's eggs and pale green duck eggs, or pushing a hand cart full of wriggling live seafood from their brigade. New sideline businesses came, Brigade's new sideline business. People came to market along the highway and byway from the township, all around, converging on the new streets and the old alley of Hibiscus Town to buy and sell, each taking a few feet of space to show his own goods amid the buzz and confusion of the market in this big mountain town. What drew everyone's eyes the most were the newly opened rice and meat markets. There were white rice and red rice, coarse rice, polished rice, in rows and rows of baskets or piled up in heaps. The vendors eager to measure it out and haggle over the price. The new policies allowed commune members who had fulfilled their grain quotas to sell their surplus grains and oil in this market. The meat market was an even more impressive sight, with the plank tables arranged in 2 long rows, as if it were a contest. Fuck, this section's long. Jeez. All right, we got one more page left. Well, we have one more page turn left. I'll continue on. Allowing people to compare and assess the pigs raised by different commune families, seeing which had the fattest sides and the thinnest skin, the tenderest flesh. Even on off days, pork was on sale from dawn to dusk. A new contradiction faced the supply and marketing cooperative. The shops couldn't move as much pork as the commune members could produce, especially since a small town like this had no cold storage. Private citizens couldn't unload all of their pigs, and the cooperative didn't know where to put the butchered meat. The relationship between supply and demand had certainly changed in the last couple of years. These mountain folks didn't know much about the four modernizations, but they had already seen the benefits for themselves and had begun to taste the sweetness of plenty. There is now no need for nostalgic or utopian deferral. The heady excitement of the periodic market and the meat glut has stimulated very immediate appetites, even implying that not entirely proper glances might be exchanged between Hong youngsters and their Yao and Shuang neighbors. Culinary variety has returned, figured most powerfully in the old categories of needed food. No more poor quality rice with gravel in it, but with white rice, red rice, coarse rice, and polished rice, along with pork that could be distinguished according to which had the fattest sides and the thinnest skin, the tenderest flesh. This is enough to make any good cook's heart sing. It even invokes the visual beauty of bustling street markets, with their arrays of colorful produce and crowds of many kinds of people. Certainly, a choice among types of rice and pork implies that more specialized choices nearby in the market as well. Whether there are tender shallots, crisp, fresh cabbages, crates or baskets full of speckled hen's eggs and pale green duck eggs, handcarts full of wriggling seafood, housewives can go back to doing what comes naturally, cooking good meals for their family. Cooking good and distinctive meals for their family. The food egalitarianism of the communal canteens, with their uniform ragouts of squash leaf, has been left far behind. These mountain folks are still depicted as not able to comprehend national policy, but nowadays they can afford to forget politics almost. A few scattered doubts remain, although there was now less to feel sad about. Still, people felt some concern about the future. Old shadows had not completely withdrawn from their hearts. They still worried about wondered about whether the left extremists would suddenly some night find a way to come back and douse these fragile flickers of hope. Could all the slogans and theories, struggles, and movements become important again, ruining people's lives and replacing the things that are necessary for life, like oil and salt and vegetables and rice? By this point, in the narrative, food has been rescued from the over-politicized this and all the slogans and theories, struggles and movements. The fear that ideology could replace the things that are necessary for life presumes a clear distinction between material sustenance and political ideologies. The Maoist state stands accused of having tried to feed the people on insubstantialized ideas. The reform regime provides a delightful new material plenty that recent abundance of food the recent abundance of food and hibiscus is contrasted with the shortages that once appeared in that once accomplished a discursive glut and a state controlled redistribution system. The real needs of the people, once again redefined after the fall of the Gang of Four, are posited as a foundation for a simpler and less ambitious state politics. That didn't sound right. Redefined after the fall of the Gang of Four, are posited as foundations for a simpler and less ambitious state politics. The state should withdraw from daily life and productive activity, allow markets and people to regulate themselves, and keep its politics to itself. The concepts of the thing that are necessary for life, so well illustrated by the list of staples, oil, salt, vegetables, and rice, that accompanies it, is seductively self-evident. With it, Hibiscus Town simplifies history. The most pervasive mass campaigns were developed several years after the national famine, but here these periods are collapsed. And economics naturalizing the present market-driven order, the need in question is that of natural human bodies that require sustenance and should not be shortchanged, even in the service of shared ideals. But the images of plenty and conviviality associated with the free market at the beginning and the end of the book have already established that the food supply cannot be separated from the quality of communal life. People need not only staple foods, but community, not only nutrition, but the special delicacies that can support a ritual life and be exchanged among townspeople. Only with a return to free market are the citizens of Hibiscus able to return to fully human status. This idea of humanity does not imply an entirely simple or natural relationship with history. However, as the quotas above suggest, people must engage in the work of remembrance through which they make their history. In particular, Gu Hua would have this reader recall the Maoist period as a time when the state's intention of meeting the needs of the people through socialist management was perverted into a cultural and continuing revolution that hopelessly muddled eating and thinking. The mundane. Are you ready to eat?
I was going to ask if you still wanted to go out.
Yeah, we can. This is my last paragraph. I'm done. The tidy division of the material from the ideological preferred by. Did I skip a line? Cultural continue. I'll just start at the beginning. It says the Maoist period as a time when the state's intention of meeting the needs of the people through socialist management was perverted into a cultural and continuing revolution that hopelessly muddled eating and thinking, the mundane and the political. The tidy division of the material from the ideological preferred by early reform writing like Gu Hua's is like a limited return to a Marxist historical materialism, in that it replaces the economic base in a foundational position. Political mobilization will no longer be relied upon to transform China. The only revolution anyone desires seems confined to a mode of production, leaving relations of production to evolve as they will in a global order that is capitalist. Whereas once the states sought to serve the people right down to the level of their quota of grain, their conversations at meals, and their historical memories, now it is content to let the market self-regulate and allow thinking, on the whole, to care of itself. Those who have some control over the means of production will presumably flourish. Those who don't will have to find a way to pay the going price for their newly diversified needs. Okay. That was a pretty cool section. I feel like it was interesting seeing how this novel depicting clearly opposites, and this what seemed like such a quick shift from socialist economic conditions to capitalist economic conditions, pointed out the desperation and troubles that they were facing, and I feel like now I'm asking myself the question: was it written? Had to have been written after the fall of socialism. So it's not like it was before the fall of socialism. Like if this was written before the fall of socialism, I feel like it might have been able to have a sort of revolutionizing effect on the people. It would have rallied them up. But it's pretty cool. It's interesting. It's interesting to not have to read the whole novel. Although I wonder how long it is. Maybe it's worth my time. What is it? The Hibiscus Town. Or maybe I'll skim the Wikipedia article. This next time we'll be watching the movie Hibiscus Town. Shijin. Oh, this is the movie. I want the book. Okay, there's nothing on the book, but the revolution have ended. Yu Yin, not regulated to lowly street sweeper. She then falls in love with. So this is the plot of the movie. It looks like they switched some things up, but because oh no, oh so yeah, okay, yeah, I see what's happening. I don't think it mentioned in the book that she became a street ever. Anyways, looks like a lot of the movie follows the plot of the book pretty well. I don't really have much else to say, so thank you for watching. Hope you learned something, and